else ever had those music playlists recommended to them by YouTube that are titled something along the lines of a playlist for a 19th century villain, a playlist for a 19th century villain plotting their revenge, a playlist for walking in the forest, a playlist for dancing with the villain, a playlist for a bunch of just all these weird fantasy type scenarios which are kind of interesting and weird and cool all at the same time. Yeah, is it just me? Is it just me that sometimes clicks on them and listens to them just to see what they're about? Okay, maybe it is. But I like listening to these playlists because I like seeing these things that people have curated and put together. And while some of these pieces include actual classical music pieces, there's also sometimes other pieces in there as well which aren't really traditionally classical music, but are sort of along the same veins. They're just written more modernly, typically within the past 5 years or so. And something about these pieces always catches my ear. What do I say in this situation when it's music? Something about these pieces always catches my ear because they're not obviously classical pieces, but there's something about them that feels like it's classical music that a lot of people really love to listen to, myself included. I don't really have a good term for these. I don't know if there's a really good genre name that's already out there for them. So for the purposes of better YouTube keywords, I'm gonna call it dark academia music for the purposes of this video. Basically, what I'm putting under this category is modern music that has been composed more recently, say within the past 5 to 10 years or so, for the purpose of sounding like classical music, but it's obviously not what we consider to be classical music. And so if it's not traditionally classical music, does that make it not classical music? Does that make it classical music? Can it be considered classical music? Where's the boundary on what is and isn't classical music? Now, obviously, any kind of elitism aside here, because I've addressed that in several previous videos that that's not really what I like to do here on this channel, I want to talk about the actual kind of definition of classical music and like how we define what is considered to be classical music and what really isn't. And so where does this dark academia music tend to line up for the most part? So is this dark academia music classical music or not? I'd say the short answer is probably no, but also kind of yes. Let me explain a little bit better. So when we look at these playlists, these kind of dark academia themed pseudo classical music playlists, there's plenty of them that have actual traditional classical music pieces in them. I'm obviously not talking about the stuff that we traditionally think of as classical music. I'm more focused about the stuff that's been produced by independent artists and composers. Is this modern pseudo-classical music classical or not? Can it be labeled under that classical music category? Well, in order to really answer this question, I think we should clearly define what we mean when we're talking about classical music. And the reality of that is the label of classical music is actually kind of flawed, because what we mean when we say classical music usually covers hundreds of years worth of music spanning what is actually a wide variety of genres. I mean, be honest, if you've ever listened to Mahler and Shostakovich and Beethoven and Mozart and Debussy and Monteverdi, those are all what we'd consider to be classical music composers, and almost none of them sound the same. Maybe a few of them, sure, but not all of them together. So classical music really isn't a great term in defining a singular genre of music in the first place. But even with this understanding, we know that not all old music is considered to be classical music. So with that in mind, what characteristics does a piece have to have in order for it to be generally considered to be classical music? Well, number one, oftentimes it's typically historical, most of the time. However, we know that there's modern classical music. For example, operas, choral works, and orchestral pieces are often still, for the most part, considered to be classical music. And there are plenty of them that are written today. But we don't consider things to be folk songs to be classical, so what else typically makes that label? Another thing that really tends to define classical music is its overall structure. Typically, classical pieces have a lot of thought put into them as to how they should be structured and how the melodies should grow and how the harmonies should change. And just the overall infrastructure of the entire song tends to have a lot more thought and detail put into it compared to other genres. This doesn't mean that all classical music has to be complex and that all non-classical music has to be simplistic. What I mean when I say that classical music tends to be written academically is that the classical music was typically written for the purpose of being complex in a way that it can be studied and looked at in an academic light. Other types of music that weren't written with that explicit academic intention in mind typically find themselves not under the label of classical music. However, this is still not the final defining feature, as we find that genres like jazz have their own academic structures and forms. So what other features is there that really defines classical music? Well, I'd say beyond the first two, the last one really is instrumentation. So anything that we would consider to be orchestral instruments usually fits into this category, as well as large choirs of singers usually singing in a more classical manner rather than like a jazz or a pop kind of style. I mean, you know these symbols of classical music. It's things such as string instruments or woodwinds or solo piano music. A lot of these instruments are highly associated with classical music. So what makes this dark academia music any different from what we think of as traditional classical music? Well, typically the instrumentation tends to be about the same, but obviously these pieces are more modern and written in a more modern or popular kind of style. The interesting thing I find about dark academia music, though, is that while it is written to mimic classical music, it does tend to be written with a very specific mood in mind, which is not something that classical music tends to do. Obviously, because it comes from hundreds of years worth of music, and so you're gonna fit a lot of styles and genres and everything under that umbrella category. But the dark academia music really seems to be different from traditional classical music in the sense of it seems to be written with an explicit purpose of fitting a mood for a playlist to be listened to. And in fact, the traditional classical music pieces that are often picked and curated to fit into these dark academia playlists also tend to match the moods that the more modern pieces are trying to create. So these dark academia playlists are not so much trying to be classical music playlists as they are trying to be mood playlists. Usually if you sit down and listen to one of these curated playlists, you'll notice that all the pieces have this kind of stereotypical sound to them. It may vary based on the title or the exact mood it's going for, but overall the pieces tend to be much softer and gentler and have an almost kind of melancholic or sentimental kind of feel to them. Most of the time, it's highly unlikely, unless you're listening to like one of those 19th century villain playlists, that you'll find any of the big bombastic songs anywhere near here. Even when you search for actual classical music playlists on places like Spotify, most of the songs that have been picked for these playlists tend to fit the more dark academia type vibe, that subdued, sentimental, melancholic, very soft and gentle pieces. You're not gonna find big bombastic Beethoven anywhere near here. And honestly, my best guess as to why so many of these even traditional classical music playlists tend to lean more towards the modern dark academia kind of sound is that I think the way we listen to music nowadays is very different than it's ever been in the past. I mean, before, going and listening to music was more of an event, so you wanted to have something of a variety of moods and genres and all kinds of other things. But nowadays we have music straight to our home. We can put it straight in our ears. And I think most often the way people listen to music the most is kind of in the background. And so we don't want big bombastic pieces distracting us for while we do other things around our house. I mean, I'm totally guilty of this. Whenever I choose to listen to music, I definitely put it on in the background. I either put it on while I do chores around the house or while I'm working on some kind of other activity, because Generally, I cannot do an activity without having some kind of sound running in the background, otherwise my brain just gets way too bored. So I like to have something going on in the background, but I don't want it to be distracting from my current activity at hand, so having that nice, soft, gentle music really helps with that. So I would wager that that newer way of listening to music, when applied to the classical music genre, tends to influence these softer, gentler pieces being more preferred. And then, if you're going to write new pieces, you're going to want it to sound like that softer, gentler sound. I mean, heck, I've even heard some people say that they prefer the dark academia type music over the traditional classical music because the traditional classical music can be really overwhelming. So if we look at dark academia music that way, you can tell it's really trying to fit into that same niche that classical music already fits. However, it is still trying to be its own thing in the sense of it's not trying to be an exact copy of classical music. It's more so trying to mimic classical music at a very specific mood. So then going back to the original question, is dark academia music classical music? Well, I think the biggest thing to remember here is that labels are tools and not rules. If you start giving things labels, and especially a lot of labels, inevitably someone will come along who will look at those labels and go, screw that, I can break that label. I can make something that fits that label and also doesn't fit that label. I can find something that fits two different labels at the same time and breaks all the rules that we have for that label. Somebody will inevitably come along and do that because that is art. And that's how art works. So when we label things, it's not a hard and fast rule. It never will be a hard and fast rule. So if you label dark academia music as classical music, no one should really get mad at you. Because like I said, labels are tools in the sense that they help us categorize things, they help us break things down into smaller groups, but they're not hard and fast rules. So yeah. But what's my take on the whole thing? Well, I'd say technically dark academia music isn't really classical music in the way we typically define classical music. But in all reality, classical music is a really bad label anyways that I could be wrong on. I have no idea. I haven't done any research on this, but I feel like it was created by like the music industry to just kind of slap it on a whole bunch of albums in order to kind of sell it better to the public. You know, in order to just kind of say classical music. So with that possibly unsatisfying ending, I think I will end this video on a little bit of a happier note and share some pieces that are actually traditionally classical that I feel would fit a lot of that dark academia kind of sound that I don't tend to see on a lot of those dark academia type playlists. So if you're looking for more recommendations or something to add to an already existing playlist, here are some of mine to you, the people. So like I was talking about and describing earlier, the dark academia music tends to be more of that softer, gentler music that's more possibly melancholic or sentimental. And I tried to find pieces that I felt would fit that kind of description. However, a lot of these aren't always super similar to each other. I feel like they fit that description that I gave in their own kind of unique way. But I did try to make sure that they were more on that softer, gentler, more background music style of things. And I really only had one sort of exception to this, which I'll address when I get to it. So first up, I have Stars by Ēriks. Beautiful piece, beautiful piece. This is a choral piece that's sort of a cappella. It's voices and water glasses, which is really cool. It has a really cool effect. Obviously it's stars, it has this very ethereal sound to it, and that is completely due to the use of water glasses in this piece. What do I mean by water glasses? I mean exactly what you probably are imagining. Glasses filled with water where you dip your finger in and run your finger along the edge. I mean, most of us are pretty familiar with how that makes sound and music. You've seen those YouTube videos of people making full-on songs from this thing, except they stuck it in an actual classical music piece. And it sounds beautiful. It gives it this just ethereal kind of sound while a choir is singing over it. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful piece. Definitely would put it on more of a dreamy kind of playlist. Next up, I have Earth Song by Frank Ticheli. This is a classic. This one's classic in a lot of choral music spheres. If you've been in choir, you've probably heard of or sung this song. If I had to pick a specific version, I would highly recommend the Seraphic Fire version because they are one of my favorite choirs, but you pick whatever version you like the best. This is another a cappella choral piece. Very beautiful. The lyrics are beautiful. How would I describe the lyrics? It's kind of vague, so that's probably why I'm having difficulty describing it. But overall, I would say the piece is about finding that warmth and refuge in the middle of a storm. That's probably the quickest and most succinct way I can boil it down just within these few seconds that I have here. Next up is The Little Shepherd by Claude Debussy. I like a lot of Debussy's pieces. I've obviously have made a video about him in the past. He's honestly probably one of my favorite composers. I think I've said that before. I don't really care. But I love Claude Debussy, and I see him and his pieces on a lot of playlists, but I wanted to go for something that I don't typically see. And The Little Shepherd, I feel like, really fits that bill pretty well. It gives me the sort of idea of somebody sort of wandering around in an open field or within a forest. It's often very open. It takes its time with things. It's solo piano, so if you're not as much into the choral stuff, I guess I should say it's solo piano if you hadn't figured that out already. But it's pretty open-ended, and it takes its time with things, and it is a little bit more on the brighter and happier kind of side. On the other side of that kind of mood, I would recommend Footprints in the Snow, also by Claude Debussy. Again, slower piece, sort of takes its time, but this one, whereas The Little Shepherd was much more brighter and happier, I would say Footprints in the Snow has a little bit more of a darker feel to it. Not necessarily sad or scary or like overwhelming, but it just has a little bit of a sadder sound to it, especially compared to things like The Little Shepherd. But it still has that open-ended, taking its time, wandering kind of feel that something like The Little Shepherd might have, just in a different mood. Going back into the choral sphere, because I can never recommend too many choral pieces, we have Duruflé's version of Ubikaritas. This one's so good. This piece in particular, I feel like, gives that very good sense of sort of like a chorale kind of feel, where it's very just steady and it keeps moving at a pretty consistent pace, but it is a little bit more modern and that it has more of an ebb and a flow to it than your chorales of like Bach would, for example. It's much more gentler. It has this really beautiful warmth to it, but it does have that sort of steady pace that you can imagine a choir singing in a church, which makes sense because it technically is a religious piece. Continuing on in that similar kind of vein, if you really like those pieces that kind of give you that feeling of being in an empty cathedral listening to a choir, we can go all the way back to the Renaissance era for William Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus. This one, again, that slower, gentler kind of pace with the beauty of the Renaissance structure to it. I would be totally willing to fall asleep to this piece in a good way every single night if I really wanted to. I feel like in terms of the descriptors, it's more in that melancholic kind of category rather than sentimental, because it does give more of that empty cathedral kind of feeling, but I still think that it has this beauty and warmth to it, where if you're looking for something to add to a playlist that just kind of calms you down and kind of brings you to this, I don't know, like gentle center, I think this piece really does a good job of that. If you like more of a traditional classical music sound in your dark academia type playlist, my next recommendation would be Mozart's K333 Sonata in B flat major, specifically the second movement. Typically in sonatas, the second movement is more of the slower one anyway. So if you're looking for a much gentler one, you can look at a lot of sonatas and then look at their second movement to see if you like that one. But I really like the second movement of the K333 Sonata. I wanted to recommend this one in particular because it is a little bit different from a lot of the other ones that I gave, a lot of choral pieces, a lot of Debussy. So Mozart is a little bit of a breakaway if you really want that stereotypical classical sound. And I think this is such a lovely piece. It's very soft, it's very gentle. It has sort of this almost carefree feeling to it sometimes, where certain melodic lines feel like it's just kind of like, oh, I think I'll go and do this. And you know what, maybe I should, at some point I should probably play it in this video. That would like make sense. I do often play the piece in many of my videos. I have like a recording of it. I often overlay, so you might hear it pop up here at some point. And obviously I like it because I still feel like it has that Mozart playfulness that a lot of Mozart pieces tend to have, just in a much more subdued and background music kind of way, because not all Mozart is super background music. If you're the kind of person that wants more of a dramatic flair but still kind of like that classical music sound, I would go for Mozart's K397 Fantasia in D minor. Yes, I remember that whole title by myself. I didn't look, I promise. But this one's a really good one if you want more of a dramatic kind of sound to your dark academia kind of vibe. I will warn that if you are the kind of person where you want these songs to be very, very calm and soothing, this one, it's gentle for the most part and has that dramatic flair, but there's plenty of times when the dynamic range does get kind of big. Because that's the thing about a lot of the background songs that we listen to. The dynamic range tends to be relatively small, which is why it works so well for background music. This one, however, tends to get a little bit loud, so if that's something that bothers you, maybe don't do that. But if you're looking for something to mix things up a little bit that still fits that mood, this one is a good one to go for. It also does not sound like Mozart at all. Like if you listen to it, you would not pick it out to be Mozart, probably until the very last few lines of the piece when it starts to get back towards Mozart. And that's because this one was written towards the end of Mozart's life, and so you can kind of tell he was experimenting with what would eventually become the Romantic era. So it's really cool in a whole bunch of different ways. And last but not least, one final piece that kind of fits that traditionally classical music kind of sound is Handel's Largo from Xerxes, otherwise also known as Ombra my Fu. I kind of gave both titles here because I've heard it both ways. I'm more familiar with the Ombra my Fu title. However, Ombra my Fu is an aria, and that has one singer singing. And for some people, listening to a solo singer sing an aria might kind of be distracting depending on the context of how you're listening to the song. So if you want more of an instrumental take, I would look it up under the title Largo from Xerxes. Both Ombra my Fu and Largo from Xerxes are the same piece. It's just that the instrumental version is associated with the Largo from Xerxes title, and the more aria solo singing version is associated with the words Ombra my Fu. So depending on which angle you want to go for that, this one kind of also fits back into that category of sort of a chorale kind of feel, but much more in a very traditional classical music feeling, rather than something like Ubikaritas, which feels more like the empty cathedral kind of feel. So like I said, each one of these pieces fits into their own little niche of kind of like that pseudo-classical, dark academia, or whatever label or title you want to give that style of music that I'm referring to. And I kind of hope that like I gave you some ideas to go off of if you were looking for something to add to your background. Or at least I hope I gave you something new to listen to that you haven't necessarily heard of or listened to before. So if you like this content and you'd like to see more of it, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And otherwise, I will see you next time. Goodbye.